Hello, this is Stephen, and this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. Well, as has been pointed out by various listeners over the years, the counterculture has always had a dark side. It's not always been peace and love. There have been bad actors, casualties, the needle, and the damage done. And in this episode, we dive into the world of revolutionary and political violence, exploring how radical groups emerged from countercultural movements and evolved into what my guest Jason Burke describes as revolutionists. Welcome. Just before we dive in, I learnt a rather awful fact the other day. Did you know that of the podcast episodes published last week, more were made entirely by AI, with AI-generated text and AI-generated voices than were made by humans? And if you're wondering why, it's simple. Companies are generating thousands of podcast episodes just for the advertising revenue. But not here. This is really me. We've chosen not to carry ads. It just wouldn't be in the spirit of what the Bureau is about. But we do have a Patreon where you can contribute to this crazy countercultural endeavour. Not just financially. Moral support and encouragement highly valued too. bureauoflostculture.com. And thanks so much to those who've already joined. It's much appreciated. Back to today. My guest Jason Burke is an award-winning British author and journalist. He's currently the International Security Correspondent for The Guardian, widely regarded as one of the experts on modern radicalisation, terrorism and global security, and he's been reporting from some very hot spots around the world. His new book, The Revolutionists, the story of the extremists who hijacked the 1970s, is a sweeping history of the period 1968 to 1979, years defined by a global explosion of leftist political violence. And according to Jason, the 1970s revolutionists were the orphans of the 1960s. They were young people who grew up in the shadows of the 50s existential consumerist vacuum and the 1960s idealistic overload. And when the student protests of 1968 failed to topple the global order, stop the Vietnam War, a radicalised minority concluded that the system was too resilient for peaceful protest. It's an incredible story, and for me at least, sort of connected the counterculture that we often talk about here with events taking place in the Middle East right now. Let's do it. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture, Jason.
Oh, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
This is an extraordinary tale. You tell it through characters and individuals along the way. So I think we should come back to talk about some of those specific characters. But what about you as a character? You sound like you've led, to the outside anyway, quite an exciting journalistic life.
I always wanted to be a journalist. When I was on my paper round in North London, and when I was about 13, and I could see these front pages, which were written by men in safari suits who disappeared off into the Congo or Afghanistan or wherever, and came back and wrote these big pieces, and I just thought it looked fantastic. And there was a great desire to travel that I had and to write, and a deep interest in history and historical events, and really wanted to sort of witness things firsthand. I've just been really lucky in that I've been able to do what I wanted to do. I mean, which isn't given to everybody. And I went up through the normal way through local newspapers, student newspapers, local newspapers. Then eventually I went overseas to sort of make my name as a foreign correspondent. Now done, nearly 30 years of primarily conflicts, but not all conflicts. I mean, I've done other stuff as well. I've done a bit of sport, done a bit of culture, and I've done all sorts of different stories, but it's taken me, all over the world. A very central theme of it, certainly since 9/11, so 2001, which was a really kind of formative moment personally and professionally, that has been political extremism, religious extremism, and violence, often referred to as terrorism. And, we can discuss that definition and how to use it. But that's been something I've written about consistently over many years. And, in another world, I would have been like a historian or something, but I just wanted to get out and do things. And, the adrenaline and the excitement of journalism, particularly back then when there was only one way to find out what was going on, and that was to go to places. There was genuinely a kind of black hole of information that someone needed to fill, and it meant physically moving, putting yourself there, finding out what was going on, and then telling people somewhere else, which was real kind of coalface reporting, which I loved, and I did it in all over South Asia and Africa and elsewhere.
Did you get into some sticky, difficult, dangerous situations?
Yeah, you do that stuff long enough and things go wrong. There were a few times which were genuinely frightening. Iraq, in the years after the invasion, so 04, 05, that was really terrifying. I mean, I was genuinely scary as hell.
We were watching at the time, people being taken hostage, people being beheaded, including journalists.
Yeah.
So, I mean, from the outside, it does seem like it's a career for the foolhardy / extremely brave.
Yeah, I mean, there's all of that. But you take you do what you can to mitigate the risks, and you decide to stop when you think it's the right moment to stop. And I stopped doing Iraq after a couple of really narrow escapes. And I think there's a real difference between covering conflicts where you've got an active battlefield, as it were, and you can kind of go to it and then move away from it, and covering conflicts as Iraq became, and many of the other conflicts became, which were basically journalists being hunted as potential hostages or just to be killed. And that really changed things a lot in Iraq, and I stopped doing Iraq then. I carried on doing Afghanistan until that just got too hairy. All of them are different. I mean, I always say to young reporters now, and they say, what's the best thing to do? And I always say, listen, if you can't file the story, you're no use to anyone. Or if you cause more of a problem because you are injured or you get detained or whatever. So the aim is to err on the side of caution. On the other hand, someone's got to go. Someone's got to say what's happening. I mean, this is one of the problems in the current conflict in the Gulf at the moment, is that we don't know what's going on in there. I mean, we don't know what's going on in Iran. We can't get in. And as a result, the narrative is being dominated by statements from Trump or statements from the regime in Tehran. And it's really hard. So, I mean, there is a certain, without wanting to sound too kind of pompous about it, there is a certain sort of sense of vacation on. There's a need there.
Presumably, it's very dismaying for you when you hear about journalists being targeted, so many journalists have died in the last couple of years, haven't they?
Yeah, it's a really bad time for the media everywhere. I mean, there's that physical danger to a lot of people on the ground, often people who are very vulnerable in Gaza, in all sorts of parts of Latin America, bits of Africa, everywhere, South Asia. I mean, Russia, the norm has shifted. I mean, there was once a time when journalists were seen as neutral or relatively neutral, at least weren't attacked, and now that's changed totally. And that comes at a time when the established, let's say, media is under massive attack economically and critically, some of which is entirely deserved and some of which isn't when you look at what the alternative is offering.
Right. Jason, let's start off with this word, the revolutionists. It's very interesting because I was sort of scribbled down here a few alternatives. We've got terrorists, we've got militant activists, we've got freedom fighters, insurgents, guerrillas, and revolutionaries. But for you, what is this word, revolutionists?
I mean, the people I'm talking about, as you say, it's largely character driven, would call themselves revolutionaries, or often did when I spoke to them, or saw their activities as revolutionary. And their enemies would call them terrorists, which is a very loaded term, can be technically entirely accurate if you're describing somebody, but in normative terms may well suggest values or judgments rather that aren't necessarily justified. So both words are really complicated. And the revolutionist is really interesting. I mean, it comes from 19th century, and it's describing pejoratively largely individuals whose career is dedicated to using violence often to foment change, radical change, massive structural change. And I thought it'd be a useful way of describing the people I was talking about. It captures something and it asks questions, which I think are important ones to be asked.
We're going to talk about the connections, particularly between some of the groups and individuals you talk about and the classical counterculture. But it seemed to me that there is something fundamentally countercultural about this whole story, because basically these groups, these individuals, they are running violently often or by force against the mainstream culture, right?
Yeah, generally speaking. I mean, the whole point of the people I'm talking about is that they come out of the late or the mid to late 60s. I mean, they are the violent fringe of a
Right.
much broader movement, which is the countercultural movement. I mean, it is by definition counter mainstream culture. I mean, there's definitely that inflection. And the project that many of them were pursuing is certainly one of radical change. I mean, it is definitely not retention of the status quo. It's the shattering of the status quo.
Even just to go back a bit beyond the classical counterculture, you had the Russian Revolution, which was effectively brought about by Bolsheviks, which is a small, I suppose they could have been called terrorist group. You got the Chinese Revolution, and behind all that, of course, is Marx. And then you mention like the situationists, for instance, in terms of a theoretical, philosophical, possible background to what happened next, and the existentialists.
I like the situationists because A, I'm just interested in them, and B, at the kind of far-reaching levels of theorizing the use of violence politically at the time, some drew on their thinking, and I think now it's quite an interesting idea to help analyze how violence can work in a political, social, cultural sphere. But I think you could exaggerate their importance overall. I mean, you just mentioned Marx and kind of the Bolsheviks and stuff. I mean, the whole point of the 60s is not only are they rebelling against mainstream culture and kind of 50s America or, dreadful early 60s Britain or whatever it was, but the left is also rebelling against and rejecting, a new generation is rejecting that kind of classic Marxism. And so one of the things that's really interesting is how kind of Che Guevara takes off as this icon. And one of the reasons is that he represents Fochismo, so the focus theory of insurgent warfare, which is basically saying, and there are various ways it's theorized, but it's basically saying you don't have to wait for the grand dialectics of history to evolve. You don't have to spend decades mobilizing the proletariat. You don't have to follow a strict Marxist-Leninist doctrine and do what the senior officials of the Communist Party tell you to do to create a revolution. You can go out there yourselves with a couple of modern automatic weapons or the equivalent and a lot of commitment, and you can create the objective conditions for revolution yourself. And that is kind of radically different from the old school Marxist approach. It's something that Moscow doesn't like particularly either, incidentally, but it's really attractive to young people who want to change things. They all read the Marx, and the Lenin particularly, but they don't want to sit around waiting for the grand processes of history. They want to go out and change things now. And Fochismo tells you can do that. That's really powerful. And it's part of the whole new left's rejection of communist structures. Within that, you have various kind of post-existentialists. You have all sorts of Maoist influence as well, another big influence. And you have a huge obvious ferment in art and in literature and in music and so why not in radical political activism and in terrorism? I mean, why would it just be restricted to other spheres of human activities? I mean, I always say terrorism is a social activity. It occurs within communities, within societies, and is necessarily determined, its form is determined and defined by prevailing broader currents, cultural or other.
That image of Che Guevara, I mean, it is one of the most enduring images of radical thinking in the 60s, isn't it? I mean, how many walls was that poster on?
Everywhere. It's worn on T-shirts by hijackers taking Lufthansa jets in 1977. It's on the wall of the apartment when Ulrike Meinhof, one of the founders of the Red Army faction, is arrested in 1972. So, I mean, it's just everywhere.
I mean, it's a very romantic image. I mean, obviously he's an attractive guy, but there's something about it, the way he looks, the way he's looking up. But in terms of just to sort of tie that loose end off, it seemed to me that the situationists or the existentialists, they're talking about, that the modern man, modern woman have become this kind of empty shell of capitalism. There needed to be a wake-up call. So the idea then is that a sort of snowball effect, that some individuals, a small group, can be the alarm clock that's going to wake a sleeping beast. As it rolls down the hill, that will gather momentum.
That moment of massive whether it's violence or insight or shattering of the constructed mirror of our everyday lives, which is built on consumerism and false consciousness, and that through violence you can explode that. I mean, I've got to say, I've read a lot of these people's writings and spoken to quite a few of them, and they're not on the whole theorizing like that.
Right.
I think it's there, but they're much more kind of pragmatic in a sense, or more rooted.
Responding to very specific situations and very visceral situations.
Well, I mean, I'll give you an example, which is the Red Army faction in Germany, so West Germany. So they thought their campaign of violence would do various things. One was, shatter the sort of false consciousness of the masses and reveal to the proletariat that had been drugged with consumerism that they were being duped. But they also thought that they could use violence to provoke massive repression on the part of the West German state, which would reveal the West German state's essential neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, actually, nature. Others don't talk about it in even sort of that developed a sense. But they all do discuss all the Marx, and they discuss all the, I mean, they know the text, they discuss all the Lenin, they discuss all the Mao particularly.
You talk about Mao's little red book as being this kind of fashion accessory as well in the 60s, isn't it?
In the Middle East, I mean, it's Fanon who is really influential for everybody. In Guevara, Carlos Marighellers, Handbook of the Urban Guerrilla, those are the sort of set texts that they've all read. And not just in kind of the Western Europe or the US. I mean, the Middle East, the leftists are all reading them. In fact, some of the Islamists are reading them. These are kind of the core canonical texts of the radical fringe of the broader countercultural movement.
Let's talk a little bit about sort of America, I mean Europe too, which we call the kind of classic counter, the mid to late 60s. Of course, the dream had been to change the world, and it was an extraordinary time when I'm fascinated to talk to people who really believed that they could change the world.
Yeah,
In fact, that the world was on the brink of change. And of course, it didn't. I mean, it did in some ways, but that grand, psychedelic, beautiful vision didn't happen. And things started to happen towards the end of the 60s, in Paris and in America, which revealed state violence. It was the Vietnam War. Do you think it was the souring of that dream as well that gave rise to some of the groups in America and in Europe, that then went on to become what we would call revolutionists?
What you see very clearly is a massive movement, mobilization globally in the mid to late 60s of predominantly young people seeking radical change. It's never quite as broad or as deep as has been said romantically. I mean, it is quite university student, middle class on the whole. There are communities in and out. But yeah, and it fades quite fast. It's kind of 67, 68, but 69 beginning to go, 70, 71, 72. And if you look at like the music of the period, you're quite quickly into like the Who singing Won't Get Fooled Again.
Right.
The Beatles' revolution, they're kind of like, well, okay, we'll have a revolution, but as long as it's non-violent, basically, which is just, as Mao said, and was repeatedly quoted as saying, revolution is not a dinner party. You're quite quickly into apolitical music or that does really well, disco and stuff. And that moment is quite fleeting. But I'd argue that actually it does do a lot. And it takes some time to do a lot. But by the late 70s, you have an enormous range of reforms, effectively. Much better protection of reproductive rights for women, divorce laws, abortion laws. You have race relation laws. You have all sorts of
gay rights.
You have electoral age, voting ages dropping, you have more money going into universities. You do get a lot of change, not economically, but you do get it culturally and socially. But that doesn't look like it's going to happen in 67, 68, 69. And that's when these groups start to emerge. And yeah, as you say, they are a fringe of a broader movement.
Here is a sidebar just to explain about some of the groups in this conversation about revolutionists. Emerging in the US between 69 and 70, the Weather Underground grew out of a group called Students for a Democratic Society, which at that time was the flagship organisation of the American New Left. For them, the utopianism of the 60s, psychedelia, communal living, anti-authoritarianism collapsed into rage at the ongoing Vietnam War. An explosion they made in New York killed 3 of their members and forced them underground permanently. And from that moment, they abandoned mass protest in favour of symbolic bombing campaigns targeting government buildings, carefully timed to avoid casualties. The Baader-Meinhof group, also known as the Red Army faction, were active intensely from 1970 to 1977 in West Germany. In the 50s and 60s, a younger generation had confronted the reality that many former Nazis remained embedded in positions of power in post-war West Germany, and that revelation radicalised moral outrage into armed struggle. Their campaign escalated from bank robberies and bombings to kidnappings and assassinations, culminating in 1977 with a national crisis involving the kidnapping and murder of the industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer. The Japanese Red Army were formed in 1971 and active internationally throughout the 70s. They'd splintered from the radical student movements in Japan of the late 1960s, particularly the Zen Kyoto. Jason's going to talk more about them, very alarming group, and he carried out international acts of terror in collaboration with Palestinian militants. The Sandinista National Liberation Front were founded in 1961, and they actually achieved political victory in Nicaragua in 1979, and they represent a sort of fulfillment of revolutionary aspiration. And for Western radicals, they inspired the belief that revolution might actually succeed. Inspired by Augusto Cesar Sandino and influenced by Che Guevara, they fused Marxism with nationalist struggle. We also mentioned the Contras, who were a counter-revolutionary terror group backed by the US and Ronald Reagan in particular in an attempt to bring the Sandinistas down. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was established in 1967, and they emerged as a Marxist-Leninist faction within the broader Palestinian national movement, active through the late 60s and 1970s. Their innovation was aesthetic as well as military. In an era saturated with media, they understood revolution as image and narrative too, a kind of poster-revolution, where the cause was disseminated through photographs, typography and spectacle, in addition to hijackings. The Black Panthers, you get the Weather Underground.
I don't talk much about the Black Panthers in my book because I'm primarily interested in those who are involved in international, the kind of first wave of the big transnational attacks in the 70s. Similarly with the Weather Underground, who are fascinating. But what you can see there, though, with both movements, actually, how by the early 70s, they're beginning to splinter.
Yeah.
They've lost their main kind of momentum. Some people are getting much more extreme, others are not. A lot of people are turning away from violence. And one of the main things, one of the main dynamics here, and it's the same in West Germany, it's the same, will be the same with the Red Brigades in Italy, is that you have this broad movement, you have a fringe that feel that they haven't gone far enough to achieve the change they wanted. They start to use violence, and that violence very quickly alienates the rest of the movement and alienates potential supporters. And that leaves them very exposed. It weakens them fundamentally, and eventually they effectively fail, or they are unable to resist state repression. And that happens in country after country. So by the mid-70s, that big wave of terrorism that you saw is largely over. There's other terrorism, but that particular type of terrorism has gone.
I suppose the group that bridged this entire thing from 1960s right up until 79, I suppose, because they've become official, is the Sandinistas. Maybe just talk a little bit about that, because they also, interestingly, were combining Marxism with like Christian liberation theology. And were an inspiration for many of those groups because they actually, in the end, did it, right? They actually succeeded, which is the only time, really, maybe apart from Iran.
That's a really good point. I mean, there are two really good things that point out there about the Sandinista who are successful. One thing is that they're a much broader movement. For me, they're sort of insurgents. They use terrorism, and this is where we get into the definitions. They keep a much broader constituency, and they do it really importantly, partly by appealing to that Catholic set of values and traditions and history, which gives them a root in the identity of their communities. And what you can see during that period is the successful groups and ones that keep going and build through the late 70s and even up into the 80s do that. They have an identity component. They're also almost all local. So they have a very local focus. Now, the Sandinista obviously had an internationalist vision, but in terms of their actual activism, strategy, and tactics, it was really, really focused. And that worked. And you see later, when the big wave of the kind of leftist stuff is over, what you see rising quite quickly is a lot of identity based violence, whether it's kind of local communities, as in Northern Ireland or in the Basque Country or Armenia or wherever it is, or it's identity groups which have a specific interest based on indigenous peoples or LGBTQI, whatever it is, you see a much greater degree of activism there. I mean, there is internationally stuff wandering around, washing through, if you like. There's kind of green environmentalism, there's campaign for nuclear disarmament stuff. But I mean, a lot of the energy has gone into these much more identity-based groups. So you have a kind of shift from the kind of big ideological stuff to the much more identity-based stuff.
Just before we leave Sandinistas, how do you feel about like the Contras? Because the Contras are interesting, aren't they? Because that's something which is like state-sponsored, and there is this whole other world of like
Completely
state-sponsored. We would call it terrorists, of course. Reagan would have called them freedom fighters. Where do they fit into all this?
The Contras are fascinating. I'm reading a lot about them at the moment. One of the definitions of terrorism, one of the best and most accepted, is the use of violence or the threat of violence to create irrational, often fear, among civilians to advance a political, religious, or other agenda. Now, that's quite broad, but also quite narrow in a sense. So were the Contras trying to do that? Yeah, probably. That will make them terrorists. Are there state-sponsored terrorists? Absolutely, lots. I mean, it's a really important discussion. It's a really legitimate discussion. It's not one that I get into particularly in my book, but what I do look at is how, for example, the Israeli response to some of the Palestinian based militant activism, they would call terrorism, others wouldn't, their response was seen by people like the CIA as counter-terrorism. That's without a hyphen. So it's like terrorism responding to terrorism. And that's in black and white in some of the reports. The British, the Israelis were going around Western Europe assassinating people they thought were connected to attacks on Israeli targets, people from the various Palestinian armed factions. The British classified, I found the file, their reports on those events, those Israeli attacks, it was Mossad, as Israeli terrorist activities. So that argument is a live one and an important one, and one that it was relevant at the time, but my book's already 680 pages, and to the Contras, and and if I'm onto the Contras, why am I not onto multiple other examples of state-sponsored terrorism? So I'll save it for another book.
Here is another sidebar about some of the individuals in this conversation about revolutionists. Ernesto Che Guevara was an Argentine doctor turned revolutionary. He became a central figure in the Cuban Revolution of 1956 to 1959 before attempting to export insurrection abroad. He was captured in Bolivia and executed in 1967, but in death he became something else entirely. The famous photograph, which was reproduced endlessly, turned him into an icon of rebellion, a figure equally at home in political discussions as on a poster on a bedroom wall. Naila Khaled emerged in the late 1960s as the face of Palestinian struggle, a member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. She gained international attention through her role in aircraft hijackings in 1969 and 70. Photographed with a keffiyeh and an assault rifle, her image circulated globally, transforming her too into a symbol of resistance. Then there's Ilich Ramis Sanchez, better known as Carlos the Jackal, a figure who seems almost to have stepped out of fiction. Active during the 1970s and early 80s, Carlos operated across borders, ideologies, and aligned himself at different times with Palestinian groups, European radicals, and even state intelligence networks. What defined him was not an operation so much as a persona, cultivated, theatrical. Ulrike Meinhof, on the other hand, was a respected journalist in West Germany during the 60s, deeply involved in the intellectual and moral debates of her time. But by 1970, she crossed a threshold, helping to found the Red Army faction. And for her, the move into armed struggle was not a rejection of ideology or thought, but an extension of it in the face of systemic violence. Mohammed Boudia represents then a kind of intersection between culture and militancy, as we're going to hear. An Algerian playwright and intellectual, he became involved with Palestinian militants in the late 60s and helped coordinate logistic and cultural militant activities, bridging artistic circles and revolutionary cells. He was assassinated in 1973. Let's move into some of the characters and sort of the bridge, I suppose, via Nicaragua and Patrick Arguello is Layla Khaled. And she's like the poster child in a way, sort of something somehow equivalent, I think, to Shay somehow. But she's a woman, right? And you met her, you've interviewed her. And tell us about that and why those incidents which involved her at the beginning of this time are so important.
Well, Layla Khaled was the most prominent individual involved in that first wave of Palestinian groups' long-range attacks, which at the time involved hijacking and were very definitely intended to be non-lethal on the whole, with some exceptions. Certainly the ones that she was involved with. She was obviously the focus of a huge amount of media attention in the West and elsewhere, but she was also meant to be. And she was selected by the Popular Front Liberation of Palestine to be that kind of celebrity, that spokesperson, the face of their group to an extent, because the leaders of the group recognize that she's very striking, she's a woman, she's highly articulate, she speaks good English, she could make the case for the Palestinians, which is what the, in inverted commas, terrorism was aimed to do, what that strategy was aiming to do. And the leader of the group, George Habash, actually said, look, they're going to call us terrorists. We need to explain our side of things. And she was perfect to do that. For a relatively short period, she became something of a celebrity. And then a long time later became something of a celebrity again as once more the face of the Palestinian nationalist cause.
What's amazing about her, the hijackings, they're not actually intending to kill anybody. They're capitalized on two things, the international flight travel and media. And so it's this moment where you can hijack or skyjack, take people hostages, and then use the media to explain your position. And the second extraordinary thing is that, maybe because there isn't any violence, is that you say that she gets arrested and ends up in a prison here in Ealing, but is not really charged with much.
They haven't got anything to charge you with it because the legislative framework is so weak at the time that they can only potentially charge her with immigration offences, because even though she's just tried to hijack a plane over British airspace. But this speaks to two things. And one thing about that, the first is that it's really the theatre of terror. As a commentator at the time said, they want a lot of people watching and not a lot of people dead. They're not too worried about a couple of people dead, it has to be said. I mean, right. Patrick Arguello, who you just mentioned, who was Layla Khaled's associate partner on the second of the hijacking she attempted, he's shot dead by an Israeli Sky Marshal, as they were known, but only after he has shot several times a steward on the plane. And there are other instances where people are killed. So there are casualties, but they're not looking for mass casualties. And certainly, there's her earlier hijacking, Layla Khaled, it not only evacuates all the passengers carefully before they blow the nose off the plane, but then hands out sweets and pamphlets and cigarettes to everybody, the pamphlets explaining the Palestinian cause. And he's a bit surprised when she gets a slightly frosty response. So there's definitely, not a lot of people dead and a lot of people watching is what they're after. And the point about Layla Khaled being held in West London police station and never actually charged and then released in a deal they do is important, because it just shows how utterly bewildered by this new threat Western governments were. They didn't have the laws to deal with it. They didn't have the security abilities to deal with it. They didn't even have the words to deal with it. They didn't know what it was. They called it skyjacking or air piracy or whatever. I mean, they had no idea. Airports were designed like train stations. You get out of a taxi, you walk in, you get on a train, you get on a plane. Same thing. So there's no kind of security to speak of, very, very limited. And all that changed, obviously.
You trace this path really from these relatively peaceful hijacking, skyjackings and bombings, which are often aimed at not actually killing anybody. Kidnapping, I mean, there's the Patty Hearst incident, isn't there, in America, where she's kidnapped by this tiny group and claim that they convert her to their cause. And then it moves into the more serious hijacking, truck bombs. And then there's the suicide attacks or events where there's no attempt to explain it at all. The goal is just terror. And it was really interesting to hear about this Japanese group who die in their attempt to raise the cause. They described in terms of, they would have been in the Second World War, the pilots who crashed into islands, right? There's no other way to describe it.
One of the things you have to say is that a lot of the long-range attacks that the various Palestinian groups are undertaking at the time are not specifically designed to kill lots of people. The ones that they're carrying out into Israel are. So there's a difference there. The whole Japanese side of things is really interesting, and how the Japanese Red Army, as it's known, come out of this kind of ferment of leftist activism and countercultural thinking and so forth in Japan in the late 60s, which is very similar in some ways, has parallels with that in West Germany and elsewhere. There's this great kind of hinterland behind it of artistic, revolutionary creativity and all sorts of other things too, which kind of fuses. You have quite a lot of the same people involved in both in some places. The 72 attack that you're talking about is in Israel. It's a El Al plane that's hijacked. It's in Ben Gurion Airport, as it's now known, which is Israel's main international airport just outside Tel Aviv. And it is unclear to this day whether it was actually a suicide attack.
Okay.
And it was described as such at the time, partly because everybody was saying things like, this is the Japanese, they do stuff, they did it in the Second World War, they're the only people who will do kamikaze and inverted commas attacks. The Arabs don't, significantly. I was reading these lines in reporting by officials saying, no, it can't be Arabs because they don't do this stuff. It's only the Japanese.
They're too cowardly. That's how it was described, isn't it?
Yeah, that's also an argument at the time, is that there's the kind of racist argument that Arabs wouldn't do it because they always run away. And the actual details of what they were planning to do in Ben Gurion, these attackers from the JRA, when they got there, are still debated, but it doesn't actually look like they wanted to die, at least not immediately. And things went slightly wrong. There was a massive shootout in the baggage area, during which they got hold of their weapons as they came off the baggage carousel and just opened up on anyone they could see and got killed by security in the airport. Now, whether that was the intention, whether they actually planned to do other things like seize the air traffic control tower, possibly seize a plane, is still being debated. But what's really interesting, as you rightly point out, is that it was seen as, yeah, okay, they're Japanese, they do that stuff, but Arabs don't. And to me, that was really important, because now, obviously, there's this idea that it is something Muslim or Arab to commit a suicide attack. That really spoke to a time when that simply wasn't the case, which is a really good proof that the kind of essentialist racist idea that there is something inherent in Middle Eastern suicide attacks is utterly without foundation.
It did bring about a sort of psychic shift, doesn't it? That people had to get used to the idea that somebody would deliberately sacrifice themselves for the cause. Let's talk about some more individuals, Jason. The one that's fascinating to me, maybe again because of the image that we have of him, is Carlos the Jackal. And he's interesting because he almost seems like a freelancer in some way. This Ilich Ramirez Sanchez. Tell us about him and how he fits into this whole...
He was kind of a freelancer in the sense that he was really interested in his own well-being rather than anything ideological, and his own myth and his own adventure. I mean, he's much more interested in his own myth than Marxism, put it that way. And what it brought him, he liked fine wines and hotels, luxury hotels, and flying first class, and lots of girlfriends. And frankly, the Palestinian cause, which he became involved in, was incidental to that. If it had been another cause, he would have adopted that. But he's really interesting because he shows us various things. He shows us how terrorism, political extremism, and religious extremism at the time was becoming much more globalized. The way, he kind of had a lifestyle that was similar to an international businessman, except his business was, killing people, blowing things up. He wasn't very good at it either, which is the other really interesting thing. So he was good at some things which are important if you're going to be a terrorist, like building teams, social relations. He was really good at sort of manipulating people, seducing people, being what made them do things, how he could make them do things for him. but he wasn't very good at the actual logistics, and a lot of the attacks he was involved in went badly wrong. But the other thing he was brilliant at was this myth making, about kind of curating his own legend. And he was very, very aware of the power of the media. I mean, he's a megalomaniac anyway. When I contacted him in prison and asked him a whole load of quite serious questions about his activities and ideology, he just sent me back a load of press cuttings about himself. So most of it was, I could have got from a Google search. That was really important. And he used that myth again and again to preserve his life in some circumstances, to stop being executed by his own group, and also to convince Eastern European regimes, but not Moscow, that he was a major threat that they needed to handle with kid gloves, really, really carefully. Otherwise, he could turn around and do something really horrible to them, which he couldn't because his capabilities were really limited. But they believed the hype. And he was very careful to make sure that they did.
And also he's like, I suppose he's one of the sort of celebrities. He'd become, at that level, a kind of cultural celebrity in some respect.
Yeah. I mean, we were talking earlier about these kind of young people who were suddenly much, much more visible in the 70s than they'd ever been before. I mean, we forget how young a lot of the people were. Carlos was 23 when he carried out his first commissioned attempted assassination on behalf of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in London. And Layla Khalid was only a couple of years older, and when she did what she was doing a year or so earlier. And Patrick Arguello, who we were talking about, was around the same age. So a lot of these people, some of the Germans were a bit older, but on the whole, we're talking about late teens, early 20s, mid-20s.
Well, let's talk about a German, Ulrike Meinhof. She's fascinated. Yeah. Again, the Baader-Meinhof group, they became sort of famous, infamous celebrities here. She's actually much more interesting than Baader, right?
Oh, yeah. Baader's a loudmouth, braggart, impulsive, bullying, serious about anything, really. A little bit like Carlos, kind of megalomaniac, narcissistic.
Yeah, she was serious, wasn't she?
She is a very capable woman. She's older. She's in her mid-30s when she becomes involved seriously with the group. She is highly intelligent, highly articulate, very well educated, really serious about changing the world. Utterly misguided, certainly by the time she gets involved with the group, and in that she becomes involved in and responsible for very violent attacks that are lethal. But it is, at this incredible point in her career where she is, as a journalist, where she's one of West Germany's most prominent left-wing public figures. She's on talk shows debating with, senior commentators and officials and such like, and is really well known. And she makes a pretty much split-second decision to go underground, to go into clandestinity with the Red Army faction. Well, it hasn't actually been called that yet, but with this group of radical, violent revolutionaries. And it's so quick that she has to call a friend to pick up her two young daughters from school that afternoon. So she's a fascinating figure, and her end is authentically tragic. I mean, she commits suicide in prison in 76, having been persecuted by her former comrades, other members of the group in prison.
You talk about that, about some of these groups were possibly the harshest, not to their alleged enemies, but to themselves, with these internal purges,
If you see these groups as almost cult-like, which they sort of are, and they're living in these sort of communes, it's all very much like the kind of wild, excessive, extreme fringe of 60s counterculture. Like Charlie Manson or someone. You can see certainly elements that are very similar. You've got these weird rules that the Red Brigades are separating couples that they feel are inappropriate for class reasons. You have all these infractions that are punished by there's Swedish groups that make people stand in the cold for ages. Others are forced to wear certain clothing. Discipline is enforced in this kind of group way. There are these self-criticism sessions, which are really horrible, where basically somebody gets picked on and just gets torn apart. And In Japan, it goes really to the absolute extreme, and they're what called the snow murders, which is this horrendous episode where one of the most radical groups goes off to sort of set up a base in the mountains in the forest in winter, and it turns in on itself and starts killing its own members. And these are young people, often quite vulnerable, in the most atrocious way, beating them and freezing them to death as part of this self-criticism and stuff. The Red Army faction compared to those was pretty mild, but inside these groups, it's definitely not peace and love.
So towards the end of the 70s, in terms of the West, it all starts to die out. And then part of the stories that you tell is how then, in a sense, it moves further east to what we're maybe more familiar with from recent times, even though that hard left politics is also informing people like Khomeini and, Al-Qaeda. That's in there too, but it's a more theological basis to it. But there's one other person which has seemed to me to be somewhat of a bridge, and also will take us into maybe a final thoughts on how this stuff relates to the theatre of terror, performance art even. And that's this guy, Mohammed Boudia. I've never heard of him before.
Oh, Boudia is really interesting. Great from the perspective of a writer and for what I was trying to show. And exactly that reason. I'm really glad, Stephen, you picked out Mohammed Boudia because no one else has done. One of the things about Boudia is he's in a lot of books, mainly ones written by Israelis or US authors, are looking at the Mossad campaign after the 1972 attack on the Munich Olympics, in which 11 Israeli athletes and coaches were killed. That campaign targeted a whole series of alleged Palestinian operators with militant groups across Western Europe. It killed about a dozen. Many weren't connected, were tangentially connected. Boudia actually was. Boudia is in all these books as one of the last victims, targets of this campaign. And because most of these books are written by Israeli or other US often sympathetic writers, he's just described as a terrorist and a womanizer. That's it. Now, he was both. Okay. I mean, he was involved in terrorist attacks. He was a very competent logistician who put together a series of terrorist attacks. He was also a terrible womanizer. I mean, just prolific. But he was also the director of an avant-garde theatre in West Paris. He was the first person to translate Molière into Arabic while he was in prison in France. He was the first director of the Algerian, effectively National Theatre, or certainly one of them. He was very involved in setting up the National Theatre in Algiers, and he'd been born in the Casbah in Algiers, and he'd had his first experience with acting and drama in prison under the French regime there before the War of Independence. And he was a poet and various other things, and a literary critic in his way. And he was a feature of the kind of French literary radical scene in Paris where he was living in the early 70s and where he was killed. He was really interesting. And I found others too who were often involved in theatre in one way or another, such as Wilfred Burza, who was the founder of the revolutionary cells in West Germany and dies in 1976 during another hijacking attack. And he was very engaged in using street theatre as a kind of agitprop tactic. And there were lots of others. I kept coming across this interest in theatre. And it's not a coincidence. And I've always argued that terrorism is a form of communication. It's propaganda by deed in the old very well used and very appropriate sense. And that's what these people were trying to do as well. And so there were lots of them who were engaged in drama and the theatre, and that kind of communication seems to me to be absolutely logical.
A way of leveraging your small amount of power on a massive scale, potentially. I mean, we talked about it early on, and not to trivialize the tragedy or the impact of it, but 9/11, the plane crashing into the World Trade Center, you could see it in terms of like a massive theatrical act of performance art in a strange way, right? I mean, we will never forget that image, and that image speaks.
The whole point is to gain attention, and you gain attention, and through the attention, which can be gained in all sorts of ways. I mean, ISIS, Islamic State, did it in this horrible way with videos that were kind of graphically brutal. Others do it by creating a visual violent event that they know will have massive imagery or power as imagery. And certainly 9/11 had an element of that. I mean, whether bin Laden knew it was going to be a kind of crystalline blue sky and whether he knew it would be filmed in the way it was filmed, I don't know. I doubt. But the point was a spectacle, which takes us back to the situation. This is what we were talking about much earlier. But this is what I'm writing about in this book is spectacular violence. And there's a reason why it's spectacular, and that is because it is there to gain attention, to make a point, to convince, to mobilize, to radicalize, to polarize, or simply to attract the powerful, the less powerful, in a bid to redress some kind of grievance.
And to prompt a response, in which case it was very successful.
Yes.
Jason, what is next for you after this book?
I think, and you raised it in our conversation, that the misdeeds of states when it comes to terrorism is really interesting and important and much less often looked at than the non-state actors.
Thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much to Jason. His book, The Revolutionists, it's a brilliant, thrilling, thought-provoking explanation of how the peace and love ethos of the 60s curdled into the bombs and blood of the 70s. He does go on to talk about what happened after the Great Hinge, as he calls it, which is the end of the 70s, which saw the emergence of the groups we're more familiar with in recent years. And his other books, Al-Qaeda, The True Story of the Radical Islam, and the 9/11 wars, go into that in much more detail. But as I said, for me, it connected the counterculture that we talk about with global events that we've seen since 9/11, particularly this notion of the theatre of terror, of these acts as spectacle meant to draw eyes, attention, media focus, as well as to cause suffering. Thanks for listening. Thanks to those who've joined our Patreon. You can join too if you'd like to help support us. As I said, it's not just financial, it's always great to hear from people. bureauoflostculture.com. You'll find more countercultural stories there to enjoy too. And you'll find more to enjoy here too, when I will see you further down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides.